All right, so welcome and thank you for joining us tonight for a virtual talk, Invasive Species in Your Backyard. My name is Colleen Inglis and I'm the Educational Program Coordinator at Lambton Heritage Museum. And although Pinery Provincial Park is one of our nearest neighbors, it isn't very often that we get to have the opportunity to work with them. And that's why it's particularly exciting tonight to welcome our speaker, Nicole Benn, and she is a senior park interpreter at Pinery Provincial Park. And she's going to talk to us all about invasive species and what that means for the natural environment of Ontario. While we're on the webinar, you can use the chat box to socialize with other webinar attendees and to make comments. Just make sure that you select all attendees if you want to address your comments to everyone rather than just panelists. And if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat and Nicole will have time for questions at the end. So without further ado, we'll pass it over to Nicole.
All right, thank you everyone for tuning into tonight's program. As mentioned, my name is Nicole. I work here at Pinery Provincial Park. So Pinery is an Ontario park. We're one of over 330 parks in our system. I imagine probably a lot of you tuning in are local or have maybe been to Pinery before, or at least know who we are, but maybe you're from further away. Maybe you've been to other Ontario parks that are closer to where you are. We have a campground here at Pinery where lots of people come to go camping. We have 10 hiking trails that people come to walk. We have a bike trail. We're right along the shore of Lake Huron, so people come here to go swimming in the lake. Lots of really fun outdoor recreational activities to do here at the park. Where I'm standing is right inside of our visitor center. I'm in front of our turtle display right now, and we've been doing a bunch of turtle programs for schools recently, so that's why I'm set up here in front of our turtles. And when the visitor center is open to visitation, you can come right into this building here where I'm standing, get a better understanding of our park and the ecosystems we have here. But tonight we've gathered to talk about invasive species, so let's get into that. Invasive species are organisms that are not naturally a part of the ecosystem. They were either introduced either intentionally or by accident. And because the native wildlife and plant life, they haven't seen these invaders before, they're not adapted to be able to deal with them like a lot of the other species where this invader came from in its native range and other places of the world. So this means the invader, the invasive species, it often outcompetes the native species we have here in Ontario and in North America. So there are a great number of invasive species, unfortunately, but to kind of kick things off for tonight, I'm going to talk about one that we're probably pretty familiar with. And even if you have never heard of this species before, I'm sure it has affected you in your life in your backyard before. So there is an invasive fungus called white nose syndrome that has been affecting our bats. It was first discovered in 2007 in Howe's Cave. That's in New York. So it was believed that this fungus was brought over on people who like to explore caves, or maybe somewhere over in Europe, exploring caves, perhaps wore the same clothing or the same boots or something like that into the North American caves and transferred those spores. So when this fungus gets onto bats, it grows on their noses, on their ears, on their wings when they're hibernating. So during the winter time, when they kind of congregate together in their caves, they go into this deep kind of slumber, this dormancy, and that's when the fungus really affects them. It starts to grow on them when they're in that dormancy. It uses up all of their fat stores, kind of takes that nutrients that the bat stored up for itself. The fungus takes it away from the bat. And the little brown bat in particular has really been affected by this disease. It used to be a really, really common bat, but since that time, since the white nose syndrome was introduced here to North America, they've declined over 90% and are now considered an endangered species. So even if you haven't heard of white nose syndrome before, but I imagine you probably have, you might have noticed that the bats in your backyard have maybe started to decline. Here at Pinery, in the summertime, we always do night hikes, at least when we are able to gather together and go out on a hike together. We go out at nighttime and we call for owls, we listen for whippoorwills, lots of other nighttime creatures, flying squirrels. It's a really fun hike to do, and one of the things we look for is bats. And what we do is we bring out an echolocation device, which looks like this. And we're able to turn it on and change the frequency that our monitor is set to, and depending what frequency we set it to, we can hear the echolocation of different bats. So it's a pretty cool device that we hold up. We listen for those bats. And I remember when I was a kid, we used to come camping here all the time. We used to go on these night hikes when I was a kid. They turned that bat detector on, and it would just be full of clicks from the echolocations of the bats. But now, as a leader of this hike, I go out, pull out the bat detector, and I don't know if I'm going to hear bats or not. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. So they've declined enough that it's kind of a hit or miss on our night hike if we are going to hear bats or not. But when I was a kid, it was a guarantee. We always heard bats when we went out on the night hike here at Pinery. So maybe you've noticed something similar in your backyards, which is unfortunate that our bats have been declining. We're trying really hard here at Pinery to help them out. We put bat boxes up so that the mothers can come and roost when they have their little babies. Those bat detectors that I was just showing you, you're able to rent one out and listen for any bats during night, which is a really fun thing to do. It's not happening right now because we're not kind of sure how sanitation is going to work with our bat detectors and kind of everything that's going on with the pandemic, but it is a project that we do here at the park. It's really fun to get involved. Maybe kind of as restrictions lift, it could be something we bring back, which would be exciting. So invasive species, that's just one example of how they really impact our wildlife here in Ontario. Invasive species are costly to manage, they're harmful to international trade, and they're a risk to human health and culture. So now I'm going to switch over to our PowerPoint presentation. Just give me a second to share my screen there for that. All right. Okay. So let's talk a little bit more about the invasive species in our backyard. I'm going to be focusing on the species that you likely have seen maybe in your community or as you're driving, or if you've gone to the beach or something like that. Invasive species you're likely to have run into. And we covered what an invasive species is, how they kind of push out the native species, how they're not naturally a part of our ecosystems, and how they were introduced. And kind of illustrated that with white nose syndrome. And there is a picture of a bat that's been infected with white nose syndrome. So you can see its nose there has got some white fuzz. That's the mycelium, or the growth of the fungus there on the bat's nose. That's what's kind of taking the nutrients out of the bats. It causes them to wake up during the winter time. So they go out looking for food and water. And often in the winter, they can't find those things because it's all frozen. So definitely they have a huge impact on our native wildlife. So what exactly is their impact? There's an environmental impact. Invasive species reduce the diversity of plants and animal species in an environment. They put native species at risk by crowding them out, which means they outcompete the native organisms for resources like light and water and nutrients. They can also prey on native species, and they act as carriers for disease or parasites that could spread to native species. The environmental impact in regards to like the white nose syndrome and how it's affecting our bats are insectivores. They're huge pest controls for us. So they're eating the insects we don't want around. There's an economical impact. There's a huge cost associated with controlling and managing invasive species. The estimated amount in Canada that we spend on this is $34.5 billion a year. Invaders negatively impact trade and industry that relies on natural resources such as forestry, fishing, agriculture. For example, the mountain pine beetle, this is a forest that's kind of been devastated by the mountain pine beetle. It's vastly expanded its range from Western Canada, and it poses a threat to Canada's pine tree population. It has caused a huge economic hit for Canada's timber industry since 2001. And British Columbia has spent over 900 million fighting this pest. So when an invasion from a non-native species occurs, it requires a significant amount of money and effort to clean up the effects and prevent further damage or spread. There's also a risk to human health and culture. Invasive species directly affect our health and well-being. For example, the giant hogweed plant, which we can see here, it can cause a rash. These are really large plants too. So this one in the picture is probably about as tall as a person. They have these like umbel-shaped flower heads. And the sap, when you get it on your skin, it can cause a reaction. It reacts with the sunlight and it will give you a burn on your skin. And the scars from these phototoxic burns can persist for many years. So definitely a plant you don't want to be interacting with and touching. And what blows my mind about the hogweed is it was actually brought over as an ornamental plant. I don't know who would want an ornamental plant that gives you a serious rash and burn, but that's why it was brought over here. So, and then also right now in the midst of the gypsy moth infestation, we are in another infestation here at Pinery with those caterpillars. Our enjoyment of the outdoors is definitely reduced by those species or by things like zebra mussels. When we go out to the beach, it impacts our recreation time on the water. So those are the gypsy moth and the zebra mussels. They're just two species that we're going to be talking about a little bit later, so I'm not going to dive right into them now. So let's move along to the first species that I want to talk about and dive into, and that's PHRAGMITES. So PHRAGMITES, you might be familiar with seeing it along roadsides. It definitely has infiltrated along in ditches. It's a pretty common invasive plant to see. So I'm sure you've seen it before. Invasive PHRAGMITES is a grass that has been appearing on roadsides everywhere. So you might be familiar with seeing it. It has been here in Ontario for decades, causing damage to our biodiversity, wetlands, and beaches. It comes from its native home in Eurasia, though we're not entirely sure how it got here. It's an aggressive plant that quickly spreads and outcompetes other native species, such as cattails. Cattails would usually be growing in the habitats that the invasive PHRAGMITES is taking over. It takes water and nutrients from these native species, pushing them out. PHRAGMITES also releases toxins from its roots into the soil. These toxins are called allelochemicals, and they hinder the growth of surrounding plants. They are identified by their bluish-green stems, you can see on the picture here, as well as by their really thick and dense seed heads. They have lots of seeds that grow really densely in their seed heads. Those seed heads allow them to be extremely prolific. So there's a picture on the right there is the seed heads kind of as they're drying up, as they would be spreading at the end of the season. Their roots can also grow to extreme lengths, and root fragments can regrow. This means when sections of PHRAGMITES roots are transferred to different sites, often on equipment. So like if there's construction in a ditch, if those construction vehicles move to another site that doesn't have PHRAGMITES, those root pieces could be translocated and spread that way. The plant can easily regrow in the new site just from one little section or piece of the root. It's another reason they can spread so easily, and another thing that makes them such damaging invasive species. So it's important to remember to clean equipment when it has been in a site that has PHRAGMITES. The seeds and roots can grow in new locations really easily. So brush off clothing and boots. Here at Pinery, we have boot brushes at the beginning of every of our trailheads, so that you can brush off your boots before you go hiking on the trail to make sure that you're not transferring any seeds that might have hitchhiked along on your boots for any species we don't want there, not just PHRAGMITES. So when removing portions of the plants, we always want to put them in the garbage and not to compost them because, again, they are very invasive and they can spread through compost. So it's good to keep in mind that there's actually a native species of Phragmites as well, though it doesn't get as tall as the invasive Phragmites, and it doesn't grow in these thick monoculture clusters like we see here on the picture. And when we see a stand of Phragmites like this, we can see how dense the stalks are growing together. There's no room for other species to exist. You can definitely see how they are such successful invaders. It's only Phragmites here in these pictures. Sometimes the stands will grow so thick that it can decrease water levels in the wetland. This happens through transpiration, which is the evaporation of water off the leaves of the plant. Water is transpired faster through Phragmites than it is from other native species that should be growing in the place of where they are. Growing densely increases the risk of fire, and it becomes a hazard to wildlife as well. There's been reports of turtles getting trapped and stuck in these dense stalks. They reduce our ability to access the water as well. They block it for our recreational uses like swimming and angling and paddleboarding, canoeing, things like that. And then when it comes to removing Phragmites, the most successful methods involve herbicides and burns. So it's really work intensive to get a stand under control. And hopefully biocontrol will be available to us to kind of help us get a handle on this grass. Introducing non-native species has to be done with care. It's a complicated thing and requires rigorous testing. We don't want to accidentally introduce another invasive species when we're trying to control an invasive species to begin with. So for Phragmites, what this means, we need to find a biological control that will not affect our native species of Phragmites. So we're looking at insects from Europe, bringing them over for release in North America. And using biocontrols is something that's been done before. Purple loosestrife has been brought under control by a beetle that was introduced to combat it, and that worked out really well. So hopefully it's a strategy that we can use with our Phragmites. Okay, the next species, another species that I'm sure you're familiar with, even if you haven't seen this insect in person before, the emerald ash borer. You've definitely seen the damage that they've caused. So they infect ash trees, and we've lost a great number of our ash trees. The emerald ash borer is an invasive wood boring beetle. It is native to parts of Asia and was discovered here in North America in 2002, but it had likely existed undetected since the 1990s. We think that the emerald ash borer was introduced to Detroit, hidden inside wooden packaging materials or shipping crates, things like that. Since its arrival, the emerald ash borer has been rapidly spreading across North America. They have devastating effects on the ash trees they encounter in their paths, and they have killed up to 99% of the ash trees they come into contact with, which is definitely something that happened here at Pinery. If you are a local to this area, you might have had ash trees on your property that this has happened to as well. And they continue to spread in all directions where ash trees are present. So this right here is a picture of the larvae. The larvae are living in underneath the wood. The females lay eggs on the bark of the tree, and the larvae feed underneath the bark. The emerald ash borer creates galleries or tunnels under the bark where they are feeding in the tree's vascular system. And this eventually kills the tree as they damage the system the tree would be using to transfer water and nutrients through its trunk. And then when the adult beetles emerge, they emerge from the bark and they leave these D-shaped holes. We can see how the insects damage the tree and how the tree bark's kind of flaking away. There in that image, there's lots of ash trees here at Pinery that look like this one in our picture with the bark kind of flaked away and with those D-shaped holes. And I'm sure it's something that you've seen as well on ash trees around your communities. And in a relatively short period of time, we've lost a tremendous amount of our ash trees. And it's a really sad loss. And this is what makes invasive species such a huge threat. And unfortunately, the story of the ash tree declining because of an invasive species, it's something that has happened before. This is an American beech, and beech trees are affected by something called beech bark disease, which is an invasive fungus that causes these canker-like wounds you'll see on the picture on the right. Eventually, the cracks grow so thick that they end up girdling the tree and killing it, because again, it can't transport its nutrients, its waters, through its trunk when its vascular system is clogged up with the growth of this fungus. And because of this invasive pathogen, beech trees have become a rare tree to spot in Ontario, just like how the ash trees are now. This is a chestnut tree. This species was devastated by chestnut blight in the early 1900s, which is also a fungal disease. It came from chestnut trees introduced to North America from East Asia. The chestnut trees there would have evolved with the fungus. They would have ways to deal with it. Where our chestnut trees, not so much. They would have never seen this disease before. Chestnuts used to be abundant. People used to collect their nuts and their seeds to eat them. And if you know that one line from that Christmas song, chestnuts roasting on an open fire, it's a really common thing that people used to do, but it's no longer a part of our North American heritage. It's not something we're able to do anymore because our chestnut trees have disappeared. There's only a few lone trees surviving, like this one here in the picture. This one is not dead, it's just a fall time picture, kind of after the leaves have dropped. So this is an elm tree. It's an elm tree that's infected with a disease called Dutch elm disease. This disease is a combo disease. It is a fungus and an insect that work together. The fungus is carried from tree to tree by the beetles. And the beetles are a native species. They're something that the tree would have been fine with dealing, something that they would have dealt with for a very long time. But when the fungus was introduced, it got carried around on these beetles, and it was really bad news for our elm trees. So you can see here on the picture on the right, the galleries that those beetles produce kind of as they're feeding inside of the tree, and then all gets clogged up with the fungus. So like all the other trees we've talked about, the elm tree too has become a rare tree to find in Ontario. So do we see a devastating pattern here when it comes to our native trees? And this is what saddens me the most about invasive species. They make species important to our biodiversity diminish and disappear. I will not see forests of beech trees and elm trees and chestnut trees and ash trees, though I did see ash trees more when I was younger and witnessed the big decline of them. But my children won't see forests full of ash trees. They won't see forests full of the elm trees and the chestnut trees and the beech trees. So invasive species that attack the vascular systems of trees, to me personally, are especially terrifying. But the next species we have to talk about kind of changes ecosystems a little bit. We're going to an aquatic ecosystem to talk about zebra mussels. I'm sure you are acquainted with these little invertebrates. They're quite a big invader of our Great Lakes and other water systems here in North America. Zebra mussels are bivalves, meaning they have two valves, bivalve. They intake water through one valve, they filter feed out what they want to consume, and then they release out the water through their second valve. Because they feed this way and because they're so prolific, there's so many of them, we have been increasing the water clarity of a lot of places that they invade. And up front, that might sound like a good thing, but with increased water clarity means the sun can penetrate deeper into the water columns, which encourages more plants to grow, plants like algae. Overall, the water quality can decline because of this. They can increase certain toxic algae to grow, which can lead to a lake turning eutrophic, which is not a good situation. Zebra mussels were originally native to Russia and Ukraine, and they were accidentally introduced to numerous other places, not just North America, and this happened through the ballast water of ships. They've invaded the Great Lakes since the 1980s. When I was fresh out of university, I got a job as a data clerk, like entering data about ballast water, and I actually worked under the lady that discovered the zebra mussels in the Great Lakes. So it was pretty cool to have that connection, but the job was a little bit depressing. So zebra mussels, they have this D shape to their shell. They're called zebra mussels because of that striped pattern on their shell that they usually have, but it's not always present. So you can see here in this image, sometimes they're just a tan color or a brown color, and they don't have the stripes present at all. But usually they do have those zebra stripes. And these are the adult zebra mussels, and it would be the zebra mussels that you're used to seeing if you've encountered them. And as juveniles, they are microscopic. In this stage, they are called villagers when they're in their kind of microscopic stage, and they're free floating, free swimming in the water. They drift in the water for several weeks before setting onto any hard surface they can find. A zebra mussel can or a female zebra mussel can produce up to 1 million offspring each year. So extremely prolific. They've been brought here to North America on the huge freighters traveling across the oceans, but we are responsible for spreading them further into North America to smaller lakes and things like that. Adult zebra mussels can survive out of water for up to 7 days. They'll attach onto the hulls of ships. The microscopic villagers, they can be inside boat motors, they can be in live wells, in bailing buckets, anything that holds water. So if that water is transferred from an infected lake to an uninfected lake, it's really easy to spread them accidentally that way. And by moving boats from one body to another, if there's the adult zebra mussels attached onto the hull, you can spread them that way as well. Even on things like canoes and paddleboards. So boats and other equipment must be washed in between visiting new sites, preferably with hot water and hot pressurized water, so like with a pressure washer. Another option is leaving your boat out in the sun to kill anything that might be living on the hull. You're gonna wanna leave that out in some hot sun for a few days to make sure. Zebra mussels attach onto hard surfaces. So here's, you can see how thickly they can attach onto things. They'll attach onto buoys, boats, docks, intake pipes, and yeah, they attach on in droves. Sometimes they become so thick that they block out intake pipes. This means that maintenance has to be done to remove them. When they grow over rocks where we swim, we need to wear shoes to prevent our feet from being cut on their hard and sharp shells, so that makes our recreational activities and swimming less enjoyable. They can also settle onto native mussels. So we have native freshwater mussels that live here in Ontario. A lot of them are considered species at risk, and the zebra mussel is not helping out that situation. The zebra mussels will start to grow on the shells of our native mussels, and sometimes they attach on, so many attach on that that native mussel just can't even move anymore to be able to survive and find its food. So yeah, a really sad story of how these invasive zebra mussels are kind of pushing out our native mussels that are supposed to be here. I did mention how they make our recreation time a little bit less enjoyable. So let's get right into our next species, who also makes outdoor time less enjoyable. So this is a moth I'm sure we're all familiar with by now. It is the gypsy moth. You'll see on my slide, it's titled the LDD moth. And the reason for that is because the gypsy moth's name has recently just temporarily changed to the LDD moth, which is the acronym for its scientific name. And the reason why that happened is because of the negative associations with the word gypsy. So it's a placeholder for now until we come up with another name. Somebody here in my office suggested that we start calling it the destroyer moth, and I quite like that. It does definitely destroy a lot of things for us. So yeah, we are supposed to be referring to it to the LDD moth. That is the correct way now, but for all intensive purposes and for familiarity, I'm going to continue calling it gypsy moth for this presentation. We are definitely well acquainted with this moth by now. The caterpillars are out, and we are experiencing another infestation here at Pinery this year, also other places in the province. So the caterpillars will be pupating come July. We are kind of in the thick of the caterpillars with their frass, their poop kind of raining down, which is not a great thing, does not make sitting outside that enjoyable. So they'll be pupating soon come July. This is the pupa of a gypsy moth. And then they emerge in their adult forms. The females and the males look different from each other. They're sexually dimorphic. So the white moth is the female, the one on the left, and then the more brown moth is the male, the one on the right. And I'm not saying that anything about gypsy moths is cool, but I do find the antenna of moths, just moths in general, a really cool adaptation that moths have. And you'll see gypsy moths especially have these the males have these really dense antennae that they're using to sense the pheromones that the females are releasing. Other moths that have really impressive antennae like that are like the Luna moth, the Cecropia moth, the Promethea moth, and the Polyphemus moth, some of my favorite moths. And that is a really cool thing about moths, how they have these really impressive antennae that they can pick up the pheromones and kind of find, the males will find their mate, follow those pheromones with those really impressive antennae. So here at Pinery, we did not spray for the caterpillars. And the reason for that is because it would be affecting all of our other caterpillars we have out here in June as well. That's not something we want to do. We have to kind of weigh the mitigation practices and determine if that's going to be healthier for our forest. And in this instance, it's not. We want to make sure that we have caterpillars around. My friend Tanya had a really great way of saying the significance of this. She said, it's like taking a sledgehammer to an ecosystem when the tool needed is a scalpel. So June is a really important time of year for our nesting birds that feed caterpillars to their babies. So we want to make sure that they have caterpillars around. There's this whole chain of things that we would be affecting if we took caterpillars out of the ecosystem, and it's not something that we're willing to do. But fortunately, our trees are quite resilient and resistant. It takes many, many years of defoliation for our trees to kind of be injured. So that's pretty lucky that they will be able to withstand this. We know that gypsy moths come in cycles. They've been studied. They will have a collapse, and you'll see the gypsy moth on the picture on the right. It's kind of laying in this V, upside down V formation. And when we start seeing that, we know that our gypsy moths are being infected by a viral and a fungal disease that cause their populations to collapse. So their infestations usually last from 3 to 5 years, and this is something we will start seeing soon. And they're going to become a background species again. The last outbreak was in 1994, so our trees here, they've seen it before. They're going to see it again. They survived, and they'll survive this time. The European gypsy moth was first brought to North America in the mid-1800s with the intention of starting a silk industry in North America. So I have the name of the man who introduced them with the intent for this silk industry. It's a French name. My French is not great, so I'm going to try my best to say his name. It's Etienne Leopold Trouvault. So he's the one that imported these destructive species. And they accidentally escaped. I was reading a report that he actually knew that they could be so destructive. So he willingly brought them here knowing the risk that if they escaped, something like this could happen. So yeah, U10. Next time you see a gypsy moth, you can curse U10, say thanks U10. So the next invasive species I'm going to talk about is something that's not here in Canada. It's called oak wilt, and it's something that I'm very cautious and afraid of. It's a vascular disease that affects oak trees. So similar to the other pathogens we talked about in regards to the ash, the beech, chestnut, and elm trees, this disease affects the tree's ability to transport water and nutrients through its trunk. And it's a fungal invader. You see the picture on the left there, that's the spore mass of the fungus. So spores is how fungus spread. The white is the mycelium, or like the growth of the fungus that would be growing underneath the bark of the oak. So it's not in Canada, but it is just across the border in the States. And I'm talking like just across the border in Michigan, like Detroit, Michigan. This invasive species is a huge concern. It's another reason to illustrate why transporting firewood or not transporting firewood is so important. If you are familiar with the emerald ash borer, and if you remember, there was bans on transporting firewood so that we didn't move the beetle. Same kind of thing here. Transporting firewood is not something that just kind of went away, kind of as the emerald ash borer decimated. It's something that we have to stay vigilant about because of other invasive species that will spread through firewood. So this fungus will infect a tree through a beetle. If you remember, I mentioned that with the Dutch elm disease, how the beetles transport the fungus. Similar kind of thing here. So not trimming our oak trees from April through July is really important because it doesn't create any wounds for those beetles to get into the tree. So if there's no entrance point for the beetles, and it also keeps the fungus out as well. So really important, don't trim your oak trees April through July. So this invasive species, it's not here yet, which is, can breathe a little bit. We have a chance to stay vigilant and prevent it. We have to try our hardest to ensure it doesn't get here. This pathogen would be devastating to our oak savanna here at Pinery. We're mostly oak trees. It is especially terrifying to think about a situation where oak wilt is present in conjunction with the LDD moth. Remember, that's the gypsy moth. So yeah, in a situation where oak wilt and gypsy moths are present in an outbreak, that's a very scary situation. And we might not be able to kind of just roll it with it how we have been this outbreak. Our trees might be more stressed if another invader comes in. So here at Pinery, there's, again, not transporting firewood, important to remember. Here at Pinery, we do invasive species removal. We pay attention to the invasive species that are in our park, and we try our hardest to remove them when it's appropriate. So one of the species that we focus on a lot, and the reason why I'm going to talk about it now is because it's pretty likely that you have this one in your backyard. This is garlic mustard. Garlic mustard is a species we focus a lot of energy on here at Pinery. We are constantly removing patches of this plant. It's something that could easily be in your backyard. It's good to know what it looks like so that you can look out for it and you can remove it off your property. It gets its name from the garlic scent it produces when the leaves are crushed. It's native to Europe, but here in Ontario, it's one of our most aggressive invaders. It spreads quickly along roadsides, trails, and fence lines. In this next picture here, the whole ground cover in this image is the garlic mustard. This is a site near Guelph. So within 5 to 7 years, garlic mustard can enter, establish itself, and become the dominant plant in the forest understory, like how we're seeing in this image. And if you remember, I was talking about the allelopathic chemicals that PHRAGMITES uses. This is how garlic mustard is able to overtake so successfully. They disperse chemicals into the soil that prevents the growth of other plants. So yeah, we do a lot of work here at Pinery trying to remove garlic mustard, and we're always keeping a vigilant eye out. We do, there's lots of other species we look out for as well, but this one in particular, once we find some garlic mustard, we immediately start pulling it. And pulling garlic mustard is a really easy thing for you to do to make a positive impact on the invasive species of Ontario by removing them. I'm gonna stop sharing my slideshow for a second, and I'm gonna show you, I'm gonna try sharing a video. So streaming videos doesn't always work the greatest when we've tried it before over online programs like this, but I'm going to try. And this was a video created by a colleague of mine in Ontario Parks, and he likes to go out with his girls, his daughters, to pull garlic mustard. So hopefully this works.
Hi, I'm Toby, and I'm with the Discovery Program at Ontario Parks. And today, my kids and I are battling alien invaders in our neighborhood forest. We love to walk through this little patch of mixed forest at this time of year to see the many native wildflowers in bloom. We've got trilliums, white ones, red ones, violets, different colors, foam flower, all kinds of beautiful wildflowers. And they're not just pretty. All of these plants are plugged into the food chain in a larger ecosystem that includes insects and other herbivores. But now, a new plant, garlic mustard, is invading this forest patch. Because those same herbivores don't know what to do with it, this plant is just growing like crazy, and it's bullying all the other plants inside.
We are trying to pick them.
So today, we're pulling as many plants as we can, being careful to get the whole root. We don't want them in our compost, so we're putting them into garbage bags, which will leave out in the full sun for a week to make sure to kill the plants. Hand pulling is a good way to control small patches, as long as you can get to it before it goes to seed, and as long as you can revisit the site to pull new plants as they come up. To control bigger patches, check out some good online resources. Many of our Discovery staff have been battling garlic mustard for years as it invades our provincial parks, especially in campgrounds. You can help by keeping your yards free of garlic mustard, especially around your camping equipment. And hey, you might even have a little fun doing it.
All right, I'm going to go back to our slideshow. So I talked about maybe a dozen invasive species tonight, but there's lots and lots more. I only talked about a few of many, many more. And it's great that you've tuned in tonight, that you're interested in learning more about invasive species, but also something about learning invasive species is that you want to learn the native species too. Immerse yourself in nature, learn more about it, because oftentimes we have native species that look really similar to invaders. So this right here, the picture on the left, is the Asian longhorn beetle, which damages trees. There's a special concern for our maple trees, as Canada has a huge maple syrup industry. This beetle comes from China, and it was first detected in Toronto in 2003, and that was successfully eliminated. But then in 2013, a second population was discovered, which was also eradicated. So really good news on this invasive species, that we're kind of able to get a handle on it, but it's something that we have to stay vigilant about in case that it kind of crops up again. But it's not here in Pinery. We do have this beetle here, you'll see on the other half of the screen, on the right half of the screen. And this beetle is a pine sawyer beetle. I've had campers bring in this beetle to me here at our visitor center thinking that it was the Asian longhorn, but it's not. It's a native beetle. It's meant to be here. It's a part of our ecosystem, and we want it around. Here are two purple wildflowers. The one on the left is spotted knapweed. It is an invasive plant we have here at Pinery that we do efforts of pulling. It's pretty common, so you might have seen that one around too. But you'll see also on the other side of the screen, on the right side of the screen, is a native flower that's meant to be here. This is blazing star. We actually have 3 different species of blazing star that can be found here in the park, and one of them is even a species at risk. So it's definitely a species we don't want to be removing. And it's something that we train our students on. Whenever we go out to do invasive species pulls, we make sure that everybody knows what we're pulling, what they look like, because these flowers do look very, very similar to one another, and we don't want to accidentally be removing a native species. So make sure you got your ID right. So these beetles here, the one on the right is a beetle we already talked about, the emerald ash borer. It has its elytra, or its wing covers open there, and we can see its wings underneath. And then the beetle on the left, that is a native tiger beetle. It's the six-spotted tiger beetle that is a metallic green, same as the emerald ash borer. A very interesting and very beautiful beetle. And once I had somebody that lives in Port Franks, which is the town just south of Pinery. They had squished one of these six-spotted tiger beetles, brought it to me here at the visitor center. Quite proud of himself that he had found this invader, the emerald ash borer, and was able to kind of kill it and eradicate it, but it was not a emerald ash borer. It was a native tiger beetle that's supposed to be here. So learning your native species so that you're not accidentally misidentifying something as an invader is really important too. Kind of sad to see that that insect lost its life just because it looks like a species we don't want here. Right, here are a couple turtles. The one on the left is a painted turtle, which is a native turtle. The one on the right is a red-eared slider. So the pet trade is something that really affects our turtles in Ontario. Our native turtles are often collected to be pets, which is not okay. It's not okay to have a wild native turtle as a pet. It is okay to have a red-eared slider as a pet. You can go to a pet store and often they're pretty common. They're a common turtle you would find as a pet. But a lot of people don't really think about what it means to have a turtle as a pet. They're very long-lived species. So that means that red-eared sliders are often released into our natural wetlands when they're not supposed to. So it's a good thing to remember. Turtles don't make great pets. If you do have a turtle you want to get rid of, don't just release it into the water. There's proper ways. There's kind of like if you take your dog or a cat to the Humane Society, there's places like that for red-eared sliders that can rehome those turtles. So yeah, learn your invasive species in contrast to the native species as well. It's a good thing to do. And just learning more about nature, always a good thing. So there are some non-native species that are considered naturalized species. So it's species like Queen Anne's lace that we can see here on the white flower in the slide here. And then there's that purple flower is called cowvetch. They're flowers that don't come from here. They're not native to here, but they don't invade our environments like some of the really aggressive invaders do. So when it comes to these plants, they're not causing a whole lot of harm, but it still would be better if there was native species in their plants. So if you see these around your property, and if you're considering maybe naturalizing your property and naturalizing your space, those are good species to know as well, that you can probably remove them for something better, like milkweed. Milkweed gets a lot of love, which is great. They're really great for pollinators, but there's lots of native plants that you can, if you have a patch of garlic mustard on your property, that you can be replacing that garlic mustard with native plants. All right, I'm gonna bring the camera back to me and stop sharing my screen. Get my camera back on, hopefully. There we go. And then we have a little, like 10 minutes now at the end for questions. Hopefully that's good.
That's great, Nicole. There was one question that popped up in the chat about when you pull garlic mustard plants, what's the best way to dispose of them? And I know he mentioned one way in the video, but is that the preferred way to do that?
Yeah, that's the best way to do it, is to dry them out so that those plants aren't able to spread again, and yeah, throw them out in the garbage rather than compost them.
So I guess if anyone has any questions, feel free to type them into the chat or into the question and answer section. You mentioned, okay, so you mentioned milkweed. Is there another plant that would be good to put in place of garlic mustard?
If you go to a garden center, they usually have native plant sections. There's lots of asters, like New England aster, goldenrods, are good plants to put in. Blazing star, even, that is a really beautiful plant. I've seen some native gardens that have blazing star in them. Yeah, there's lots of different options.
When you're talking about the LDD moth, does the wrapping the tree with burlap help to reduce that infestation?
Yeah, so the idea there is when you like wrap around the trunk, then the caterpillars are not able to get up into the canopy. And yeah, it makes an impact, definitely. Like they kind of get backed up on the trunk there. And I remember kind of last summer, my dad lives in Port Franks, which is the community I mentioned before, just kind of south of the park. And his trees, he had done that. And there was, yeah, the tree trunk was just coated in the moss. So it did make an impact on reducing the amount that we're making it to the canopy.
We do have a couple questions about specific species. So are orange lilies invasive?
So there's a few different lilies that are orange. The native one is Michigan lily is one common name that I've heard it referred to as. I've also heard it referred to as tiger lily, but I think there is an ornamental lily that's called tiger lily that is not a native, so it kind of gets confusing there. But yeah, there is a lily called Michigan lily that grows here in the park. It's a really beautiful orange lily, like really big, beautiful lily, yeah.
What about balsam Himalayan? Someone mentions that they have that in their yard and they're wondering if they should be concerned. Anything about that?
I'm not sure.
Yeah.
There are lots of ornamental plants. Like if you go to a garden center, you find a lot of ornamental plants that are usually like non-native plants, but not necessarily invasive plants. It's just gonna be that one tree in your yard. It's not gonna try to spread, but it is kind of important to remember that with trees that are not native, often the caterpillars here, they can't eat them at all. They're not really doing an ecological service other than looking good in our yards.
I guess, are the conservation authorities doing anything for like property owners in terms of dealing with like garlic mustard? Someone mentioned that they did do something like that with PHRAGMITES.
Yeah, I don't know because I'm not affiliated
Yeah.
with the
Yeah.
conservation authorities. But yeah, we do post here in Ontario parks, like Rondeau was doing a burn for their PHRAGMITES. So yeah, I'm kind of, my knowledge is kind of restricted to what we're doing in Ontario parks.
Sure, yeah. Do you know anything about May apples? Are they okay? Or are they invasive? Or
yeah, they're a native plant. Yeah,
they're
May apples.
So I guess just because something might be kind of taking over a spot in your yard and it's invading doesn't necessarily make it an invasive species. It just might be taking over that spot. Would that be the case, perhaps? Or
It's possible, but usually with non-native and invasive species is that they do make those like monocultures, and you see them kind of all congregated together in a big patch. And most of our native plants don't do that. So if you're seeing a plant doing that, it's a pretty good indicator that something's up.
Good to know. How big do zebra mussels get?
They're not very big, like that big.
Okay. Just trying to see if there are any other questions that I've missed here. This was great. Very informative. You covered a lot of different species for us. I know, and a lot of them that affect our site here at the museum as well. I know. I think we built some bat boxes last year to try and encourage our bat population to at least live in the right place as well, rather than in our historic buildings.
Yeah.
Oh, someone's also wondering whether or not you've seen the black bear at the Pinery.
I have not. I've heard all the sightings, but I have not encountered it yet.
All right, well, I think it looks like there's a bit of a lull in the questions right now. So I'd just like to thank everyone for listening and contributing your questions. And thank you very much to Nicole for delivering a really great and informative presentation for us tonight.
Well, thanks for tuning in.
Yeah, and I think the Pinery is open for business now, and hopefully our museum still remains closed, but hopefully we'll be open to the public soon.
Yeah, and Ontario Parks is offering free days during the week, so like Monday to Thursday, and that's not just Pinery, it's all Ontario Parks. So yeah, free entrance those days. They're still on the weekends and Fridays, kind of lumped in with the weekend.
So a great opportunity to come out and enjoy nature then.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, well, thank you everyone. I think that will conclude our presentation for tonight.
Perfect. Thanks. All right.